In a silent courtroom, a tense atmosphere dominates. A sterile millionaire faces his ex-wife who demands child support for a son he could never have fathered due to his condition. Just as the judge is about to deliver the verdict, a little beggar girl bursts into the room, walks toward the millionaire, and points at the woman's current husband's child. "Sir, that is your son." The ex-wife freezes. The entire court falls silent, and in the following minutes, the millionaire does something so shocking that it frightens everyone present. The creak of the heavy wooden door echoed through the courthouse as Richard Mendez walked in, his impeccable suit contrasting sharply with the dark circles under his eyes. At 52, the successful businessman had never imagined he'd find himself in this situation. His heart pounded erratically as he walked down the central aisle, feeling the weight of their stares. In the front row, Helen, his ex-wife, wore a subtle smile. Beside her, a 4-year-old boy played distractedly with a toy car. Richard quickly looked away, trying to contain the mix of emotions that threatened to suffocate him. The infertility diagnosis he'd received at 25 had never stung so sharply as it did in that moment. His hesitant steps led him to the defense table, where his lawyer, Mr. Martinez, awaited him with a grave expression. The documents scattered across the table seemed like a death sentence for his reputation. For the past few days, the papers were full of it, the millionaire who refused to acknowledge his own son. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and Judge Taylor entered the courtroom. Richard felt his legs threaten to buckle. For 20 years, he had built his company from the ground up, dedicating every minute of his life to his work. Mendez Development had become synonymous with excellence, and he, a paragon of integrity in the real estate market. Now, everything was about to crumble. Helen rose, adjusting her expensive dress with practiced elegance. Her current husband, Edward Vance, an up-and-coming local politician, remained a few seats behind, observing everything with an air of superiority that made Richard's stomach churn. The judge began the session, and Helen's lawyer, Ms. Carmen Sanchez, was the first to speak. "Your Honor, my client has remained silent for 5 years, protecting her son from unnecessary exposure. But we can no longer allow this child to be deprived of his rights. Mr. Mendez must step up to his responsibilities as a father." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his last consultation with Dr. Silverman almost 3 decades ago. The doctor had been categorical. He could never have children. That diagnosis destroyed his first marriage and haunted him for years until he met Helen. She said she didn't care, that their love was enough. Lies, he now realized. "My client has a definitive medical diagnosis of infertility," Mr. Martinez argued, his firm voice echoing through the room. "This lawsuit is nothing more than an extortion attempt." Helen let out an indignant gasp, and the boy, startled by the sudden movement, dropped his toy car. The toy rolled until it stopped at Richard's feet. For an instant their eyes met, and he felt his heart clench. The boy had brown eyes, like his. "We have here, Ms." Sanchez continued, "recent reports that question the validity of that old diagnosis. Medicine has evolved greatly in recent decades, Your Honor, and the physical resemblances between father and son are undeniable." Richard watched as a series of photographs were presented to the judge. His hands trembled beneath the table. How could there be so many similarities? The shape of the chin, the set of the eyes. Could he have been wrong all these years? "We request a DNA test, Mr. B," Martinez declared, causing a stir in the courtroom. "Objection, Your Honor." Ms. Sanchez's voice was shrill. "My client will not allow her son to be subjected to invasive procedures that could cause psychological trauma. The child already suffers enough from paternal rejection." Judge Taylor adjusted his glasses, studying the documents before him. The silence in the room was suffocating. Richard felt beads of sweat trickling down his back as a cruel doubt began to form in his mind. What if the diagnosis was wrong? What if that boy was really his son? Considering the complexity of the case and the need to protect the minor's well-being, the judge pronounced, "I grant a period of 2 weeks for the parties to submit supplementary documentation. During this period, I order temporary child support of 30% of Mr. Mendez's income." The gavel fell, temporarily sealing his fate. Richard barely registered the murmurs that spread through the room. His gaze was fixed on the small toy car, still lying near his feet. When he bent down to pick it up, he noticed something strange, a peculiar scratch on the side of the toy, identical to a mark he used to make on his own toy cars as a child. Before he could examine it more closely, Edward quickly approached and snatched the toy from his hands. "Stay away from my stepson," he whispered with a malicious smirk as he led Helen and the boy out of the courthouse. Richard remained seated, devastated, as the courtroom emptied. His fortune, his reputation, his sanity, everything was on the line. And now, that mark on the toy car wouldn't leave his mind, fueling doubts that threatened to consume him completely. Richard spent a sleepless night rummaging through old boxes of photographs in his empty apartment. The sprawling 4,000-square-foot space, once a source of pride, now seemed to suffocate him with its silence. Among dozens of newspaper clippings about his real estate ventures, he found a yellowed photo, himself at 7, holding a toy car with the same mark he'd seen on the boy's toy. His hands trembled as he picked up his phone. The day's headline featured his face alongside a photo of the boy with the caption, "Millionaire denies son, cruelty or justice." Social media comments were tearing him apart, calling him a monster, a coward. His secretary had already reported 3 cancellations of important contracts just that morning. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Mr. Martinez. "We need to talk in person," he said, an urgency in his voice that made Richard's stomach sink even further. 15 minutes later, his lawyer entered the apartment carrying a heavy briefcase and an even heavier expression. "Dr. Silverman," Martinez began hesitantly, "the doctor who gave you the infertility diagnosis. He passed away 3 months ago." Richard sank onto the sofa, feeling the weight of that information. "And there's more," the lawyer continued. "All the medical records from that time have disappeared from the hospital. It's as if your history never existed." The bottle of whiskey in the glass cabinet beckoned, but Richard resisted. He needed to keep a clear head, even if each new piece of information felt like a stab wound. "How is that possible?" he asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I don't know, but Helen's team is already using it against us. They're suggesting you forged the original diagnosis to avoid responsibility." Martinez opened his briefcase, spreading documents across the coffee table. "And there's one more thing. They found records of your substantial donations to an orphanage over the past 5 years. Those are legitimate donations," Richard protested, rising abruptly. "I've been doing that since I started becoming successful. I always wanted to help children who—" "I know," Martinez interrupted gently, "but they're painting it as an attempt to ease your conscience. Their narrative is perfect, the absent father trying to compensate for abandoning his own child by helping others." Richard walked to the window, looking out at the city he had helped build. Its buildings rose against the sky like monuments to his hard work, his integrity. Now, every achievement seemed tainted by doubt. Martinez's phone rang, breaking the silence. The call lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to leave the lawyer visibly disturbed. "Helen is giving a live interview right now. She's got the boy with her." They quickly turned on the television. There she was, elegant as always, practiced tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. The boy sitting on her lap looked confused and frightened by the cameras. "I just want my son to have the father he deserves," Helen said, her voice choked with emotion. "Richard, if you're watching, look at him. How can you deny your own flesh and blood?" The camera focused on the boy's face, and Richard felt his heart stop. The boy was holding a new toy car and unconsciously made the same gesture Richard used to make in his childhood, spinning the front wheel with his thumb 3 times to the right. "Turn it off," he murmured, feeling suffocated. Martinez complied, but the damage was done. The images would be seared into his mind, torturing him. "Richard," Martinez called softly, "we need to consider the possibility that—" "No," Richard cut him off more sharply than he intended. I need to find Dr. Silverman's original file. There must be a copy somewhere." Just then, his cell phone vibrated with a notification. It was a message from Edward, Helen's current husband. "We could resolve this easily. Why don't we talk? Dinner tonight, 8 p.m., La Bella Italia." Richard showed the message to Martinez, who immediately protested, "It's a trap. Don't go alone." "What choice do I have?" Richard replied, his voice heavy with defeat. "If there's any chance of understanding what's happening." The lawyer left shortly after, leaving Richard alone with his devastating doubts. In the blank screen of the powered-off TV, his reflection showed a broken man, so different from the confident entrepreneur he used to be. And the night had barely begun. La Bella Italia was practically empty at that hour. Richard entered the Italian restaurant he used to frequent in happier times, noticing how the maitre d' avoided his gaze. Another small humiliation to add to the many of the past few days. Edward was already waiting for him at a discreet table in the back, a glass of red wine in his hand and a calculated smile on his face. "Richard, glad you could make it," he said, gesturing to the empty chair. "I imagine you could use a drink." "Let's get straight to the point," Richard cut in, sitting down but refusing the offered wine. His hands trembled slightly under the table, and he clenched them into fists to hide it. "Always so serious," Edward chuckled softly, taking a long sip. "You know, Helen told me how you were different before, more sensitive. The infertility diagnosis must have been devastating." Richard felt his jaw tighten. The casual mention of his most vulnerable moment by this man he barely knew was like salt in an open wound. "If you came here to provoke me—" "On the contrary," Edward interrupted, leaning forward, "I came to offer a solution. 15 million. A discreet, out-of-court settlement. You acknowledge paternity, pay retroactive child support, and this whole circus ends." The waiter approached to take their orders, but Edward dismissed him with a gesture. Richard watched the man hurry away, probably eager to escape the palpable tension hanging over the table. "It's a small price for your reputation, don't you think?" Edward continued. "Your stock has already dropped 12% since the first hearing. The longer this drags on—" "How did you get the photos?" Richard cut in, his voice a restrained whisper. "The resemblances, the boy's gestures, how?" Edward's smile faltered for an instant, so brief it might have been Richard's imagination. "Are you suggesting something, Richard?" "Careful. Slander is a crime." A movement at the restaurant entrance caught Richard's attention. A small girl, no more than 6, ragged and barefoot, was trying to enter, but was being blocked by the maitre d'. Something about her, perhaps her fragility or her frightened gaze, made him stand up instinctively. "Excuse me," he murmured, leaving a visibly irritated Edward behind. He approached the entrance just as the maitre d' was trying to shoo the little girl away. "I'll cover her meal," Richard said, surprising himself. The girl looked up at him, her eyes large and dark like deep pools. "Mr. Mendez, this isn't appropriate." The maitre d' began, but Richard was already leading the child to a table near the kitchen, away from disapproving stares. "What's your name?" he asked gently, signaling for the waiter. "Maria," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes wandered around the restaurant with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Richard ordered a full meal for her, ignoring the disapproving looks from the staff and Edward's sarcastic smirk from the background. For a few minutes, he watched in silence as little Maria devoured the plate of pasta as if it were her last meal. "Do you always come here?" he asked, trying to distract her from the embarrassment she was beginning to show for eating so ravenously. Maria shook her head. "I only come when they're here," she mumbled between forkfuls, discreetly pointing to the table where Edward remained, now on the phone. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "They who?" But before the girl could answer, Edward appeared beside him, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "We need to finish our conversation," he said, his friendly tone contrasting with the firm grip of his fingers. "Uncle Edward!" Maria exclaimed suddenly, dropping her fork. The metallic clatter echoed through the silent restaurant, and Richard saw Edward's face pale for a second before he recomposed himself. "Do you know this girl?" Richard asked, standing up slowly. "Never seen her before in my life," Edward replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Come on, we have business to discuss." When Richard turned his attention back to Maria, she had already disappeared, leaving only a half-eaten plate and a host of new questions hammering in his mind. Edward pulled him back to the original table, but Richard barely heard his words now. His mind was focused on the girl's reaction, the undeniable recognition in her voice, and the momentary panic he'd seen on his adversary's face. The sleepless night left deep marks on Richard's face when he arrived at the office the next morning. His secretary, Sandra, a woman who had been with him for 2 decades, awaited him with a worried expression and a pile of papers in her hands. "3 investors cancelled their meetings today," she informed him, following him into his office. "And the bank, they want to reschedule the review for the new development's financing." Richard slumped into his chair, running his hands over his tired face. The empire he had built was crumbling before his eyes. 20 years of hard work and an unblemished reputation being destroyed by a lie. Or was it the truth? "There's one more thing," Sandra continued hesitantly. "The court-appointed social worker is here. She said she needs to conduct an evaluation of your work environment." Before Richard could protest, a middle-aged woman with grey hair pulled back in a severe bun entered his office. "Mr. Mendez, I'm Brenda Morris," she introduced herself, her analytical gaze sweeping the room. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." For the next hour, Richard endured a thorough interrogation about his routine, his habits, his ability to care for a child. Each question was like a needle in his heart, reminding him of the dream of fatherhood that had been denied him so long ago. "Do you live alone in that large apartment, sir?" Brenda asked, making notes on her clipboard. "Yes," he replied, his voice betraying a deep weariness. I always thought one day I'd have a family to fill that space." Something in his tone made Brenda look up, her professional gaze softening for a moment. "Mr. Mendez, I need to ask, why are you fighting this paternity so hard, if there's a chance, however small?" "Because it's a lie!" Richard exploded, standing up abruptly. "Because I spent years accepting I could never have children. Because Helen—" His voice failed him. "Helen knew. She promised me it didn't matter." The ensuing silence was broken by a commotion in the hallway. Sandra rushed in, her face pale. "Richard, you need to see this." On the computer screen, a viral video was spreading across social media. Helen, in front of a hospital, held the boy in her arms while speaking to the cameras. "We just came out of a traumatic consultation. My son is having nightmares, calling out for the father who refuses to acknowledge him." Richard felt his legs weaken. The boy in the video indeed looked dejected, clutching the same toy car. The camera zoomed in on his sad little face, and again that gesture, the thumb spinning the front wheel 3 times to the right. "Excuse me," Brenda murmured, making more notes. Her face had regained its professional hardness. I think I've seen enough for today. As soon as she left, Richard collapsed into his chair. Sandra approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. There's something strange about all this, she said softly. That hospital, it's the same one where Dr. Silverman worked, isn't it? Richard looked up, an idea beginning to form. Sandra, are you still in touch with Mary, the nurse who retired last year? I am. She's my neighbor. Why? She worked with Dr. Silverman for years, Richard said, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. Maybe... The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Martinez. Richard, we have a problem, his lawyer said, his voice tense. Edward Vance just got a restraining order against you. He's alleging you threatened him last night at the restaurant. Richard felt his blood run cold. What? But that's absurd. He has 2 witnesses, the maitre d' and a waiter. They're saying you were agitated, that you made veiled threats, and there's more. They're using the incident with the street girl to suggest you're mentally unstable. The world seemed to spin around Richard. Through his office window, he could see the buildings he had constructed, monuments to a life dedicated to honesty and hard work. Now, every achievement seemed poisoned by doubt and slander. Richard, Sandra called softly, her motherly concern evident on her face. What are you going to do? He looked at the portrait on his desk, an old photo with Helen from when they were happy, or at least he believed they were. I need to find that girl from the restaurant, he replied, his voice firm for the first time that day. She's the key to all of this. The retired nurse's modest house was in a quiet neighborhood on the south side. Richard parked 2 blocks away, following Sandra's instructions to be discreet. His heart pounded as he walked along the uneven sidewalk. This could be his last chance to find any proof of the original diagnosis. Mary Silver, the ex-nurse, had a face lined with expression wrinkles and kind eyes that widened in recognition. Mr. Mendes, my goodness, it's been so long. I saw your case on TV. Mary, I need your help, he interrupted, his voice almost pleading. You worked with Dr. Silverman for 25 years. I need to know if you remember my case. Ma, the old woman invited him in, offering coffee that he accepted more out of politeness than desire. His hands trembled slightly as he held the antique porcelain cup. Of course, I remember, she replied, sitting in a worn armchair. It was one of the most difficult cases I witnessed. The doctor was devastated to have to give that news to someone so young. Richard leaned forward, anxious. Is there any chance the diagnosis was wrong? Mary frowned thoughtfully. The doctor ran the tests 3 times. He was always very meticulous, especially with such serious diagnoses. She paused as if choosing her words. But in the last few months before he died, he was different, worried. He even mentioned someone was snooping through old patient files. A shiver ran down Richard's spine. When exactly did this happen? It must have been about 4 months ago. He even changed the password for the digital archive and... Mary stopped abruptly, bringing her hand to her mouth. Oh dear, it was right after that man started showing up at the hospital. What man? Richard asked, his heart almost stopping. A local politician, always very elegant, but there was something intimidating about him. She hesitated. Edward, something. Richard nearly dropped his cup. Edward Vance? That's him. He showed up frequently, always wanting to talk to the doctor in private. The last time I heard an argument. The doctor was upset, saying he wouldn't participate in something. 3 days later, Her voice faltered. The heart attack was so sudden. The screech of tires in the street made them both jump. Richard ran to the window in time to see a black car speeding away. Mary, he said, his voice urgent, Do you still have access to any documents from that time? Anything? The ex-nurse stood up, walking to an old piece of furniture. The doctor gave me a few things to keep before, well. She rummaged in a drawer, pulling out a yellowed envelope. I don't know if this helps, but before she could finish, violent knocks sounded at the door. Police! Open up immediately! Richard felt his blood run cold. Mary, pale, quickly hid the envelope inside a book on the shelf. Out the back, she whispered, pushing him towards the kitchen. Quick! Crossing the backyard, Richard could hear raised voices coming from the house. His heart hammered in his chest as he hopped the low wall, landing in a narrow alley. The sound of approaching sirens made him run without a clear direction. After several minutes, exhausted and breathless, he finally stopped in a small park. He sat on a bench, trying to catch his breath and process what he had discovered. Was Edward involved in Dr. Silverman's death? What was in that envelope Mary tried to give him? His phone vibrated, a message from Sandra. Richard, the police are at the office. They're saying you broke into a residence and threatened a witness. Edward Vance is filing a formal complaint. Another message arrived immediately, this time from an unknown number. You should have taken the deal. Now it's too late. Richard looked around, feeling watched. The park was almost empty, except for a few children playing in the distance, and his heart leaped. Sitting on a swing, alone, was Maria, the girl from the restaurant. She stared at him with her large dark eyes, as if she had been waiting for him. He stood up slowly, fearing she would disappear like last time, but before he could take a step towards her, a police cruiser entered the park, its lights flashing menacingly. Richard watched helplessly as the cruiser approached. Little Maria remained on the swing, her bare feet barely touching the ground. She was his only chance to find out the truth, but if he was arrested now, all would be lost. An elderly woman walking her dog passed between him and the cruiser, providing a few precious seconds of distraction. When the officers got out of the car, Richard had already hidden behind a large tree, his heart beating so loudly he feared they could hear it. "The girl!" one of the officers said, pointing to the swing. But when they approached, Maria had already vanished. Richard saw her running into a narrow alley between two old buildings. Without a second thought, he followed in the same direction. The chase led him through unfamiliar alleys, always keeping a safe distance from the small figure ahead. Maria moved with the familiarity of someone who knew every corner of that urban labyrinth. Finally, she stopped in front of a simple diner, the kind that catered to local workers. "Why are you following me?" she asked, surprising him with the firmness in her childish voice. I need to understand," Richard replied, trying to catch his breath. "You know Edward. How?" Maria looked around nervously. "They come here all the time. They say things when they think no one is listening." "They who?" "Uncle Edward and the pretty lady from the courthouse," she replied, fidgeting with the hem of her worn t-shirt. "They give food to Joe, the waiter, so he lets them talk after closing." Richard felt a knot in his stomach. "What did you hear?" Before Maria could answer, a shout cut through the air. "There he is!" It was the waiter from La Bella Italia, pointing in his direction while talking on his cell phone. "Come on!" Maria grabbed his hand, pulling him into the diner. They rushed through the kitchen amidst surprised stares from the staff, exiting through the back into an inner courtyard surrounded by old buildings. "Here!" She guided him to a rusty door that led to an abandoned basement. The smell of mildew was strong, but it was a safe hiding place. Through a crack in the wall, they could see people's legs hurrying past outside. "I come here when it rains," Maria explained, sitting on an old crate. "No one ever looks here." Richard watched the girl with a pang in his heart. How many children like her lived invisibly in the streets of the city he had helped build? "Maria," he began softly, "I need you to tell me everything you heard. It could be important." She hesitated, biting her lip. They were talking about a doctor. Uncle Edward was mad because the doctor didn't want to lie anymore. Lie about what? About an important paper, and about the boy not being... She stopped abruptly, her wide eyes fixed on something behind Richard. He turned just in time to see a shadow moving at the basement entrance. His cell phone vibrated, another message from the unknown number. "We found you." "Is there another way out?" he whispered urgently. Maria nodded, pointing to a narrow passage between stacked boxes. "It leads to the other side of the block, but only a small child can fit through." Richard felt despair growing. Heavy footsteps approached the basement entrance. "Maria, listen," he said quickly, pulling a card from his pocket and scribbling a number. "This is my secretary, Sandra. If you find out anything else, call her. She'll help you." "But what about you?" "I'll be fine," he lied, placing the card in her small, dirty hand. "Now go." Maria hesitated for a moment before disappearing through the narrow passage. Richard took a deep breath, preparing to face whatever was coming through the basement entrance. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing 3 police officers with less than friendly expressions. "Richard Mendez," one of them said. "You're under arrest for trespassing, making threats and stalking a minor." As the cold handcuffs closed around his wrists, Richard thought about the irony of his situation. His entire life built on honesty, and now he was being taken away like a criminal through the streets he helped build. But something in Maria's story lit a small flame of hope. He wasn't crazy. There really was a conspiracy. The question was, could he prove it before it was too late? The police station cell was cold and impersonal, like everything else that endless night. Richard sat on the concrete bench, his aching back protesting against the hard surface. Through the bars, he could hear the murmur of reporters already gathering at the station entrance. Mr. Martinez arrived 2 hours later, his usually calm face etched with worry. "They're requesting you be held without bail," he informed him bluntly. "Edward claims you're obsessive, that you pose a danger to the boy." "Martinez, you need to listen to me," Richard whispered, moving closer to the bars. "Dr. Silverman's nurse, she has proof. And the street girl, she overheard conversations." "What nurse?" Martinez interrupted, frowning. "Richard, Mary Silver had a domestic accident an hour ago. She fell down the stairs. She's in the hospital, unconscious." Richard's blood ran cold. "Accident? No. It can't be a coincidence." "The envelope she tried to show you is gone," Martinez continued. "The house was completely ransacked during the supposed accident." Richard closed his eyes, the weight of guilt crushing his chest. Another person hurt because of him. How many more would suffer before this story ended? "And there's more," Martinez lowered his voice further. "Helen has filed a lawsuit for emotional distress. She's claiming your actions caused psychological trauma to the boy. They have a psychiatric report. Bought and paid for," Richard cut in, "like everything in this circus." An officer approached, indicating that visiting time was over. Martinez placed a hand on Richard's shoulder through the bars. "I'll try to get the no bail order reversed, but I need you to promise to control yourself. No chasing street kids or breaking into houses." "That girl is the key to everything," Richard insisted. "She knows. She's a street kid." Martinez raised his voice, frustrated. "No judge will accept her testimony against a respected politician and his wife." After Martinez left, Richard was taken to a cell in the back, where he would spend the night. Lying on the thin mattress, staring at the peeling ceiling, he tried to piece together the puzzle. Dr. Silverman dead under suspicious circumstances, the medical records gone, the secret conversations at the restaurant, the nurse's accident. The sound of his cell phone being returned to his belongings at the front desk roused him from his thoughts. Through the small, barred window, he could see the sky beginning to lighten. Another day of his life crumbling. "Mendez," an officer called. "Your secretary is here." Sandra entered the cell area, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "We got you released on bail," she said, her voice trembling slightly. But, the company board has called an emergency meeting. They want your temporary leave of absence." Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. The company was his life, his legacy, built from scratch, brick by brick, contract by contract. "The stock has fallen another 15% since your arrest," Sandra continued, avoiding his gaze. "Investors are nervous. Edward Vance gave an interview suggesting you're mentally unstable, that you might have jeopardized other deals." "He's destroying everything," Richard murmured, his hands shaking. "My reputation, my company, my life." "There's one more thing," Sandra hesitated. "Brenda Morris, the social worker. She recommended to the judge that you be prohibited from approaching the boy until the end of the trial. Her report says you exhibit erratic and obsessive behavior." Richard sank onto the bed, the reality of his situation finally hitting him with full force. In just a few days, everything he had built over decades was being systematically destroyed. A young officer approached with his belongings. As he picked up his cell phone, Richard noticed an unread message from an unknown number. "I know where the nurse's envelope is. Meet me tonight at the playground in Willow Creek Park. I'll bring a toy car just like his." His heart raced. Was it Maria or another trap? "Richard," Sandra called, concerned by his sudden silence. "What are we going to do now?" He put the phone in his pocket, feeling the weight of every wrong decision that had brought him here. "Now," he replied with a calmness he didn't feel, "we're going to find out just how far they're willing to go to maintain this lie." The playground at Willow Creek Park was silent at dusk, the shadows of the play equipment casting distorted shapes on the ground. Richard remained in his car, watching. Martinez had warned him not to do anything reckless, but what choice did he have? The nurse was in the hospital, his company had abandoned him, and his reputation was in tatters. Sandra had insisted on accompanying him, parking her own car across the street as a backup. "Any suspicious movement, I call the police," she said over the phone. Richard silently thanked her for still having someone by his side. 20 minutes passed before a small figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't Maria, but a boy who looked to be about the same age, carrying a toy car identical to the one Richard's alleged son had. Heart pounding, Richard got out of the car. The boy approached, looking nervously around. "Maria sent this," he said, handing over a crumpled envelope along with the car. "She said she can't come because they're watching her." Richard took the items with trembling hands. "Is she okay? Where?" But the boy had already disappeared into the darkness. Quickly returning to the car, Richard first examined the car under the interior light. It was exactly like the boy's in the courthouse, down to the smallest detail. Turning it over, he found a faded label, "Limited Edition, Vance Toys, 1985. His heart almost stopped. Vance, Edward's last name. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope. Inside was an old, yellowed photograph showing a group of children in front of a toy factory. In the front row, a boy held the same model of car. The caption identified him: Edward Vance Jr., son of the owner. His phone vibrated. A message from Sandra. "Black car just pulled up on the corner. I think someone's watching." Richard quickly pocketed the photo and the car, starting the engine. As he maneuvered to leave, his mind raced furiously. Edward wasn't just an opportunistic politician. He was the heir to a bankrupt toy company. But what was the connection to Dr. Silverman? He had barely turned the corner when bright headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. The black car was following him. Richard accelerated, his heart hammering in his chest. Through the mirror, he saw Sandra trying to keep up from a distance. His cell phone rang. It was Martinez. "Richard, where are you? Helen just filed an emergency motion with the court. She's saying you're still stalking the boy, that you were seen near his school today." "What? That's impossible. I don't even know where he goes to school." "They have witnesses, Richard, and photos." A car screeched to a halt in front of him, forcing him to swerve violently. Another black car had appeared, trying to box him in. He was being cornered. "Martinez, I have to go," he said, turning sharply onto a side street. "Look into Vance Toys. This story isn't about me or the boy. It never was." Hanging up, Richard focused on trying to lose his pursuers. Years of driving across the city to visit construction sites had given him a good knowledge of the city's back streets. After several risky maneuvers, he managed to shake them off temporarily, parking in a dark alley. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. What was happening? Why would an old toy factory be important enough to motivate murder and extortion? His phone vibrated again, a message from an unknown number. "Hillcrest Hospital, room 304. The nurse is awake. Hurry before it's too late." Richard glanced at the clock. 11:45 p.m. Visiting hours were long over, but this could be his only chance to find out what was in the original envelope. However, with the new stalking accusations, if he were caught, another text arrived, this time from Sandra. "I'm okay, lost them. Richard, I just got an anonymous call. Dr. Silverman didn't die of a heart attack. The initial ME's report indicated poisoning, but it was changed, and Edward Vance visited the hospital that night." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of each new revelation. People were dying. His life was in ruins. And now he had to choose between risking his freedom by going to the hospital or possibly losing his last chance to prove the truth. The distant sound of sirens made him shrink back in his seat. Somewhere in the city, Maria was still hiding, trying to help him, despite the danger. The nurse was awake, possibly with answers. And in his home, an innocent boy was being used as a pawn in a much larger, more sinister game than he imagined. Hillcrest Hospital cast long shadows against the night sky. Richard parked in the back, his heart thundering in his chest. The white lab coat Sandra had managed to get from a doctor friend felt as heavy as lead in his hands, a falsehood to uncover the truth. What kind of person was he becoming? He put on the coat, adjusted the fake ID badge, and took a deep breath. The service corridor was quiet at this hour. A nurse walked past him without looking up, busy with her clipboard. Richard kept his head down, trying to look natural as his stomach churned with nerves. The elevator seemed to take an eternity. When the doors finally opened on the third floor, he almost bumped into someone rushing out, a man in a dark suit who looked familiar. Stepping into the empty elevator, Richard felt a chill. Where had he seen that face before? The third-floor corridor was silent, except for the steady beeping of heart monitors. Room 304. The door was ajar. Richard hesitated, his heart nearly pounding out of his chest. If he was caught here. A faint moan came from inside the room. He pushed the door open slowly and entered. Mary Silver lay in bed, a bandage on her forehead and several visible bruises. Her eyes opened as he approached. "Knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They knew too." "Mary, I'm so sorry," Richard murmured, taking her frail hand. "This is all my fault." "No," she cut in with surprising strength. "It's their fault. Edward, he came here today, wanted to know about the envelope." Richard moved closer. "What was in it?" "The truth about the factory," she replied, her eyes filling with tears. "Dr. Silverman was the company doctor. He found out something terrible. Toxic materials in the toys, Richard. Children died." The floor seemed to drop out from under Richard. "The Vance toy factory." Mary nodded weakly. "Edward's father covered it all up." The doctor was forced to falsify medical reports. Carrying that guilt destroyed him. When Edward started blackmailing him to falsify your records too, a noise in the hallway made her stop. Footsteps were approaching. "The envelope," she whispered urgently. "It's not lost. Little Maria, the street girl. She saw where they hid it, in the same place where—" The door burst open. It was the man from the elevator, now accompanied by 2 security guards. Richard finally recognized him, the detective who had authorized his arrest. "Richard Mendez," he said, his voice cold. "You're under arrest for trespassing and harassment of a patient." "He didn't harass me," Mary Silver protested, trying to sit up. "Ma'am, you're under the influence of strong medication," the detective cut in. "You don't know what you're saying." The guards grabbed Richard by the arms. He didn't resist. He knew it would be worse if he did. As he was dragged out, he heard Mary Silver cry out, "The warehouse! Look in the old factory warehouse!" In the hallway, a small crowd was already forming. Nurses and patients watched the scene, some filming with their cell phones. Richard could imagine the next day's headlines. "Businessman stalks witness in hospital." His cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He managed a quick glance before it was confiscated. It was a message from Sandra. "Found something about the factory. Edward isn't an only child, had a sister who died young, poisoning by—" The detective snatched the phone from his hands before he could read the rest. As he was led to the elevator, Richard caught a glimpse of a familiar small figure disappearing behind a door. Maria, the street girl, her large eyes full of concern. "You don't understand," Richard tried to explain to the detective. "People died. Children died. This is much bigger than—" "You have the right to remain silent," the detective cut in, a cold smile on his lips, "and I suggest you exercise that right." On the ground floor, a news crew was already waiting. Richard lowered his head, trying to hide his face from the cameras. How had Edward orchestrated everything so quickly? How many people were involved in this conspiracy? Through the hospital's glass doors, he saw Helen standing by her car, the boy half asleep in her arms. She smiled when she saw him in handcuffs, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The boy lifted his sleepy head, his confused gaze meeting Richard's. In his small hands, he was distractedly playing with a toy car, identical to the one in the old photo. The cell was even colder the second time. Richard sat on the same concrete bench, his aching back protesting as he watched the intense activity at the police station. This time, it wasn't just reporters outside. There were protesters, some defending him, others condemning him. Martinez arrived earlier, looking like he'd aged 10 years in a few hours. "I got a court order for your release," he said, running his hands through his graying hair. "But there are conditions. You're prohibited from going near the hospital, the nurse, the boy, and now little Maria too." "How do they know about her?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. Edward gave another interview. "He's saying you're manipulating a street child to create false evidence." Martinez hesitated. "And there's more. The company board voted. You're officially suspended." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of each word. 20 years of work, of building, of integrity, all crumbling like a sandcastle. "But Sandra found something," Martinez continued, lowering his voice. "Edward's sister, Laura Vance, died at age 6 in 1988. Lead poisoning. The family hushed it up, but the hospital records exist." "The toys," Richard murmured. "They were poisoning children with their own products." "And Dr. Silverman was the doctor responsible for covering it all up," Martinez completed. "When Edward needed someone to falsify his medical records, he looked for someone who already had experience lying," Richard concluded, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. "But why? Why this whole charade with the boy?" Martinez pulled a newspaper from his briefcase. The headline showed Edward at a political event. Vance announces gubernatorial bid. He needs money for the campaign, Martinez explained. And what better source than a wealthy businessman with no heirs? If he could prove the boy is your son, he'd have access to everything, Richard completed, feeling nauseous. My company, my assets, it would all go to the boy. And who would control it all until he grew up? The mother and the stepfather, Martinez confirmed. It's a perfect scam. And now, with you looking obsessive and dangerous, they can sue for full custody. An officer approached, indicating that time was up. Richard stood, his legs trembling. Martinez, he called, I need you to do something for me. That old factory warehouse. I need to know where it is. No, Martinez cut in. Enough foolishness. You need to focus on getting your company back, your reputation. You don't understand, Richard whispered urgently. It's not just about me. That girl, Maria, she's trying to tell me something about the warehouse. What if there's proof there? Records of the children who died? Martinez hesitated, looking around nervously. The factory was in the old industrial district. The warehouse is still there, abandoned. But Richard, they're expecting you to do something like this. One more count of trespassing, and you could be jailed without bail. Richard nodded slowly, but his eyes had a different glint. For the first time in days, he felt he was close to the truth. After signing his release papers, he left through the back of the police station to avoid the reporters. Sandra was waiting for him in the car, her face etched with worry. I got another anonymous message, she said as she drove. Little Maria, she's asking for help. Said she has something to show you at the warehouse, but she's scared. Edward has people looking for her. Richard looked out the window, watching the city he loved so much blur past. Somewhere, a street girl carried the weight of a terrible truth. Elsewhere, an innocent boy was being used as a pawn in a game of power and greed. His phone vibrated. It was Helen. Congratulations. Your crazy antics are traumatizing our son. He won't stop crying, asking why his father hates him. Richard felt his heart clench. Even knowing it was manipulation, every word was like a dagger in his chest. Then, another message from an unknown number. Tomorrow, 3 a.m. at the warehouse. Come alone. Last chance. Sandra noticed his expression change. What is it? Nothing, he lied, putting his phone away. He couldn't involve anyone else. Too many people were already suffering because of him. The sun began to set, painting the sky a blood red. In a few hours, he would have to make a decision that could cost him his freedom, or finally reveal the truth that so many wanted to keep buried. The moonless night made the industrial district even more foreboding. Richard turned off his car's headlights as he approached the abandoned warehouse of the former Vance Toys, his heart hammering against his ribs. The deteriorated building loomed like a grotesque shadow against the dark sky, its broken windows like vacant eyes watching his arrival. He had disobeyed every court restriction to be here. If caught, no court order or lawyer could help him. But what choice did he have? Little Maria was in danger. The nurse was under surveillance at the hospital, and somewhere in that abandoned warehouse lay proof of a crime that had destroyed families. The creak of the rusty door echoed through the empty space as he entered. The weak beam of his flashlight revealed dusty shelves and time-worn boxes. The smell of mildew and decay was suffocating. "Maria?" he called out softly, his whisper echoing off the peeling walls. A faint noise came from the back of the warehouse. Richard advanced cautiously, his flashlight dimly illuminating the path. He stumbled over something, an old toy car, identical to the one in the photo. Dozens of them were scattered across the floor, covered in a thick layer of dust. "Richard," a childlike voice called from the shadows. "Over here." Maria was huddled behind a broken shelving unit, her large eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. She seemed even smaller and more fragile than he remembered. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice trembling. "They know." "What are you talking about? Who knows?" "Uncle Edward," she replied, tears streaming down her dirty face. "He saw me take this." Her small hands trembled as she held a yellowed envelope. Richard approached slowly, his heart nearly stopping as he recognized the handwriting on the envelope, Dr. Silverman's. "Where did you find this?" "The nurse threw it out the window when they broke into her house," Maria explained. "I saw where it landed. Inside are pictures of sick children and papers with names, and this—" She pulled an old leather wallet from the pocket of her worn dress. Richard took it with trembling hands, opening it under the flashlight beam. Inside was a faded photo, a young Edward Vance, arm around a little girl, his sister Laura. She was holding a toy car just like the one scattered on the floor. "My sister died because of those toys," a deep voice echoed from the darkness. "And my father made me promise no one would ever know the truth." Richard spun around. Edward emerged from the shadows, his usually controlled face contorted with a mixture of fury and pain. Behind him, two large men blocked the exit. "So you faked this whole son story," Richard said, instinctively stepping in front of Maria, "to get money for your political campaign." "You don't understand," Edward snarled. "I needed the money to buy more silence. Dr. Silverman was about to confess everything. Helen, she found out the truth by accident going through my old papers, threatened to expose me if I didn't help her." "And the boy?" Richard asked, his voice shaking with anger. "How could you use an innocent child in this sick game?" "The boy is my son," Edward admitted, his voice heavy with bitterness. "Helen got pregnant before she met you, but he can't know. No one can know. My political career, everything I've fought for." A noise from upstairs made them all look up. Richard seized the distraction to push Maria towards a side passage between the shelves. "Run!" he yelled. "Get them!" Edward bellowed. Richard ran through the darkness, guiding Maria between the dusty shelves. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit echoed through the empty warehouse. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it was about to explode. They reached a dead end, a wall of boxes stacked to the ceiling. Maria pointed to a narrow gap between them. "This way." "I won't fit," Richard gasped. "Maria, listen, take this." He thrust the envelope and the wallet into her small hands. "Find Sandra, she'll know what to do." "But what about you?" Heavy footsteps were rapidly approaching. Richard gently pushed the girl into the narrow passage. "I'll be fine," he lied, knowing this was likely his last attempt to do the right thing. "Now go." Maria hesitated for a second before disappearing between the boxes. Richard turned to face his pursuers, hearing the sound of her small footsteps receding into the darkness. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. The truth would finally come out, even if he wasn't free to see it happen. The impact of the first punch sent Richard staggering back, the metallic taste of blood flooding his mouth. Edward's two men cornered him in the dark warehouse, their shadows cast by the faint light filtering through the broken windows. "Where's the girl?" Edward demanded, his voice trembling with rage. "Where are the documents?" Richard spat blood onto the dusty floor. "It's over, Edward. You can't hide the truth anymore." A second blow struck him in the stomach, making him double over in pain. Through the haze of agony, one thought kept him conscious. Every second he bought was more time for Maria to escape with the proof. "You don't understand," Edward said, approaching. In the gloom, his usually controlled face was distorted by a mixture of fury and fear. "My sister! You don't know what it's like to watch someone you love waste away day after day, helpless to do anything." "Then why keep protecting those responsible?" Richard wheezed, trying to buy time. "Why not expose the truth?" "Because the truth destroys everything," Edward exploded. "It destroyed my family. It destroyed Dr. Silverman, and now—" He paused, a bitter smile forming on his lips. "Now it's going to destroy you." Sirens began to wail in the distance, rapidly approaching. Edward's smile widened. "The police are on their way. You know what they'll find? A mentally disturbed businessman trespassing on private property, stalking a street kid. Richard tried to get up, but one of the men pinned him to the ground with a foot on his back. The dust from the floor filled his lungs, making it hard to breathe. "You know what your tragedy is, Richard?" Edward continued, crouching beside him. "You actually believed in justice, in truth. But in this world, people like you always lose." The sirens were closer now. Red and blue lights began to dance on the peeling walls of the warehouse. "Edward," a female voice echoed from the darkness. Helen emerged from the shadows, her face pale with panic. "We have to go. Now." "Not yet," he snarled. "I need to make sure he doesn't—" "The boy is gone," Helen cut in, her voice breaking. "Matthew, he heard everything, our whole conversation in the car. He ran off as soon as we got here." Edward froze. "What?" "He was crying, saying he wanted to see Uncle Richard," Helen sobbed. "When you told me to wait in the car with him, he must have followed us here. He heard you say you're his father." The sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside. Authoritative voices began to shout orders. "You have 5 seconds to come out with your hands up," a magnified voice boomed. Edward ran his hands through his hair, his control finally crumbling. "Find the boy," he ordered his men, who immediately scattered into the warehouse shadows. Richard managed to sit up, his ribs protesting with every movement. "He's scared, Edward. Alone in the dark. Is this what you want for your son?" Something in Richard's voice seemed to reach Edward. For a moment, the calculating politician gave way to the terrified father. "Matthew!" he yelled, running into the darkness. "Son!" Helen stayed behind, trembling. Her eyes met Richard's. I never thought it would come to this," she whispered. "Police, last warning." "Go," Richard said softly. "Take care of him. He's going to need his mother now more than ever." Helen hesitated for a moment before disappearing into the shadows, leaving Richard alone with the echo of the sirens and the weight of all the lies that were finally beginning to crumble. The warehouse door burst inward. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating Richard sitting on the dusty floor, surrounded by abandoned toy cars. "Hands where I can see them!" an officer yelled. Richard obeyed slowly, raising his hands. Through the broken windows, he could see the sky beginning to lighten. Somewhere in the night, a street girl carried the truth that had cost so many lives. Elsewhere, a frightened boy was discovering his entire life had been built on lies. And there, kneeling on the floor of that abandoned warehouse, Richard realized that some victories come disguised as defeat. The holding cell was crowded that early morning. Richard sat in a corner, ignoring the curious stares of the other detainees who recognized the businessman from the headlines. His body ached from the blows he'd received, but it was the pain in his heart that consumed him. The image of little Matthew discovering the truth in the worst possible way wouldn't leave his mind. Hours dragged by until Mr. Martinez appeared, his face a mask of concern and, surprisingly, a faint smile. "Things have changed," he said, sitting on the other side of the bars. "Little Maria, she made it." Richard leaned forward, his heart quickening. "Is she okay?" "She's safe. Sandra found her wandering near the office and took her straight to Child Protective Services, the documents she handed over." Mr. Martinez shook his head in admiration. "They're devastating. Medical reports, toxicity tests, letters from Dr. Silverman. There was even a diary from Edward's sister." A lump formed in Richard's throat. "And Matthew? Mr. Martinez's smile vanished. They found him 2 hours ago, hiding in a church. He's in shock. Brenda Morris, the social worker, she's personally looking after him now. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of guilt. An innocent child, his world destroyed by lies and greed. There's more, Mr. Martinez continued. Nurse Mary Silver has fully regained consciousness. She confirmed everything, the blackmail, the threats, Edward's involvement in Dr. Silverman's death, and Helen. He hesitated. Helen is cooperating. I think seeing her son in that state finally made her realize the monster she helped create. An officer approached, opening the cell. "You're free to go," he said without making eye contact. "Court order." In the station hallway, Sandra waited, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Beside her, to Richard's surprise, was Brenda Morris. "Matthew wants to see you," the social worker said, her professional expression softened by compassion. "He won't stop asking for Uncle Richard." "He only has you now," Sandra explained gently. "Edward is on the run. Helen is in custody. And the boy, he remembers how you tried to protect Maria, said it was the only time he'd seen an adult do the right thing." Richard felt tears burning his eyes. "Can I?" "Yes," Brenda replied. "But we need to go now. There's someone special who wants to be part of this meeting." The drive to the temporary shelter where Matthew was staying was made in silence. Richard watched the city awaken through the car window, the first light of day painting the sky in soft hues. How could so much pain exist in such a beautiful place? At the shelter, a surprise awaited him. Maria, the little street girl, was sitting next to Matthew on a worn-out sofa. The two children were sharing a bag of cookies, talking in low voices. "Uncle Richard!" Matthew ran to him as soon as he saw him, hugging his legs. Richard knelt, ignoring the pain in his ribs, and hugged the boy he had for so many nights dreamed was his son. "I'm sorry," Matthew whispered between sobs. "I didn't know. They made me memorize all those things." "It wasn't your fault," Richard replied, his voice choked with emotion. "None of this was your fault." Maria approached timidly, her large dark eyes shining with a wisdom beyond her years. "I told Matthew you're different from other adults," she said. "You're not afraid of the truth." Brenda cleared her throat softly, drawing everyone's attention. "We still have a lot to sort out," she said, "but I thought you all needed this moment, and—" She smiled, for the first time since Richard had met her. "Perhaps we can start discussing some possibilities for the future, for all of you." Richard looked at the two children, one born into wealth but raised on lies, the other grown on the streets but with a heart full of truth. Both victims of a cruel adult world, both desperately needing a place to call home. "Uncle Richard," Matthew called hesitantly, "will you still want to be my friend, even though I'm not—" "Always," Richard interrupted, his voice firm despite his tears. "I'll always be here for you, for both of you." The sun finally broke over the horizon, its golden rays streaming through the shelter window. Maria smiled, a true smile that lit up her small face, marked by life on the streets. And in that moment, amidst the ruins of so many lies, something new and true began to be born. A week passed in a whirlwind of events. Richard watched the city from his office window at the company, now returned to his command after an emergency board meeting. On his desk, newspapers blared headlines that seemed surreal. Vance scandal, the truth about the toy factory, fugitive politician wanted for murder, businessman cleared of all charges. Sandra entered silently, placing a cup of coffee on his desk. "Nurse Mary Silver was discharged today," she informed him with a gentle smile. "She's recovering well at her daughter's house." Richard nodded, grateful. "Doctor?" Silverman's former nurse had become a key part of the case against Edward, her testimony revealing years of blackmail and threats. "And there's one more thing," Sandra continued hesitantly. "Helen asked to speak with you. She's cooperating with the investigation and—" "No," Richard cut in softly. "Not yet. First, I need to take care of something more important." Grabbing his jacket, he headed for the elevator. On the ground floor, Mr. Martinez waited with a folder of documents. "Are you sure about this?" the lawyer asked. "It's a huge responsibility." "It's the right thing to do," Richard replied, his voice firm for the first time in weeks. The drive to the shelter was made in contemplative silence. Brenda Morris awaited them at the entrance, her usually stern face softened by a discreet smile. "They're anxious," she said, guiding them down the hall. "Especially Maria. I've never seen that girl so hopeful." In the activity room, Matthew and Maria were sitting together drawing. The boy seemed lighter, as if an immense weight had been lifted from his small shoulders. Maria, still shy but no longer so frightened, looked up as they entered. "Uncle Richard!" Matthew ran to hug him, a gesture that had now become natural between them. Maria remained in her seat, watching with her large, dark eyes. "I brought something to show you," Richard said, sitting down with them at the small table. "Mr. Martinez placed the folder in front of him, and he opened it carefully. "Are these papers?" Matthew asked, confused. "They're very special documents," Richard explained gently. "This one," he picked up a form, "is an application to be your legal guardian, Matthew, with your mother's permission, who wants you to have a stable life while she sorts some things out." The boy's eyes widened. "You mean I can come live with you?" "If you'd like to," Richard replied, his heart quickening. "And there's one more." He picked up another document. "This is an adoption petition. For you, Maria." The girl froze, her small hands tightening around the colored pencil she held. "Adoption?" she whispered, as if the word were too magical to be real. "You saved not only me, but many people with your courage," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed more integrity and strength than many adults. And you deserve a home, a family. Are we going to be brother and sister?" Matthew asked, looking at Maria with shining eyes. Maria remained silent, silent tears streaming down her face. Slowly, as if afraid it would all disappear, she stood up and walked to Richard. Without a word, she hugged him with all the strength her small arms could muster. Brenda discreetly wiped her own tears, clearing her throat. "We still have a lot of process ahead of us," she said professionally. "Evaluations, visits, adjustment periods." "But we'll stay together, right?" Matthew insisted, joining the hug. "Yes," Richard promised, holding both children. "We'll stay together." Mr. Martinez watched the scene with an emotional smile. "You know," he said softly to Brenda, "in all my years of practicing law, I've never seen a family rise from the ashes of a tragedy so beautifully." Through the shelter window, the afternoon sun bathed the room in a golden light. On the floor, the children's drawings showed 3 figures holding hands, one large and 2 small, under a bright blue sky. "Uncle Richard," Maria called shyly, still in his arms, "can I tell you a secret?" "Of course," he replied softly. "I always wanted a dad," she whispered, "but I never thought I'd get a brother too." Richard felt his heart overflow. There, in that simple room in a temporary shelter amidst legal proceedings and children's drawings, he finally understood. Sometimes you have to lose everything you think you want to find exactly what you need. 6 months later, Richard's apartment was overflowing with life. What was once an empty, cold space was now filled with children's laughter, drawings taped to the refrigerator, and scattered toys. None of them, of course, from the old Vance factory. On that special morning, Richard was helping Maria with her bow tie while Matthew ran down the hall, already fully dressed in his small suit. It was the day of the final adoption hearing, and anxiety hung in the air like perfume. "What if the judge changes her mind?" Maria asked in a low voice, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her new dress. "She won't," Richard assured her, tucking a stray strand of her hair, now well cared for and braided, behind her ear. "You've been my daughter in my heart since day one. Today is just about making it official on paper." Sandra arrived early to help, bringing a special breakfast. She had become a sort of aunt to the children, her motherly love overflowing in small gestures of affection. "Nurse Mary Silver called," she informed them, while pouring hot chocolate for the little ones. "She sent her best wishes. She and her daughter are coming to the celebration later." Richard smiled, grateful. "Doctor?" Silverman's former nurse had recovered completely, and her testimony had been crucial in unraveling the entire plot. Edward was still on the run, but his network of influence had crumbled after the exposure of the toy factory's crimes. Helen was doing community service and undergoing therapy, her cooperation with the justice system having resulted in a lighter sentence. More importantly, she was finally being the mother Matthew needed, now that there were no more lies between them. "Dad," Matthew called. The word still made Richard's heart leap even after 3 months of temporary guardianship. "Can Maria be my real sister too, not just on paper?" "She already is," Richard replied, watching how the two had become inseparable. "Family isn't just about blood, son. It's about love, care, and choice." The courtroom was different that morning. There was no longer the weight of accusation, the tension of lies. The same walls that had once witnessed so much pain now bore witness to a moment of pure joy. Brenda Morris was there, her usually serious face breaking into a genuine smile when she saw the children. Mr. Martinez, too, carrying a much lighter briefcase than before. Inside, only the final adoption papers. Judge Taylor, the same judge who had presided over the previous case, seemed like a different person. Her stern countenance had been replaced by an almost paternal expression as she read the final documents. "Maria," she called gently, "do you understand what adoption means?" The girl, once so timid, stood tall with confidence. "It means I'm going to have a real dad and a real brother," she replied. "But I already do. We're just making official what our hearts already know." An emotional murmur rippled through the room. The judge smiled, visibly touched. "Richard Mendez," she continued, "you built a life based on integrity and truth. You lost almost everything defending those principles, and in the process, you gained something far more valuable." She paused significantly. "It is with great satisfaction that I approve this adoption. As of today, Maria is officially your daughter." The sound of the gavel was muffled by applause and joyful shouts. Maria jumped into Richard's arms, tears of happiness streaming down her face. Matthew joined the hug, yelling, "We're a real family!" At the celebration that followed, in a small restaurant near the courthouse, Richard watched his children play. Maria, who once lived in the shadows, now shone with her own light. Matthew, free from the burden of secrets, was back to being just a 5-year-old boy, full of joy and energy. Sandra approached, handing him an envelope. "This arrived early this morning," she said softly. Inside was a letter from Helen. "Richard, I can never apologize enough for what we did, but seeing you transform all that pain into love, giving a home not only to Matthew but also to Maria, it makes me believe there's still good in the world. Thank you for teaching my son the true meaning of family." Richard put the letter away, his heart overflowing with emotion. At the table, Matthew was teaching Maria how to make paper airplanes, while she showed him how to draw perfect stars. Two children, Ming-Yun brought together through a storm of lies, now building a future together based on the purest truth. "Dad, come see," they called in unison. And Richard went, knowing that every step towards them was a step towards the true meaning of wealth. Not the kind measured in bank accounts or companies, but the kind counted in smiles, hugs, and small moments of pure happiness. Because sometimes we discover that the greatest treasure isn't what we protect in vaults, but what we cultivate in our hearts. And on that sunny afternoon, surrounded by the love of his children, Richard finally understood that he had gained far more than he had ever lost.